Hi, today we listen to The Mystery of the Baghdad Chest by Agatha Christie. The words made a catchy headline, and I said as much to my friend Hercule Poirot. I knew none of the parties. My interest was merely the dispassionate one of the man in the street. Poirot agreed. Yes, it has a flavor of the Oriental, of the mysterious. The chest may very well have been a sham Jacobean one from the Tottenham Court Road. None the less the reporter who thought of naming it the Baghdad Chest was happily inspired. The word mystery is also thoughtfully placed in juxtaposition, though I understand there is very little mystery about the case. Exactly. It is all rather horrible and macabre, but it is not mysterious. Horrible and macabre, repeated Poirot thoughtfully. The whole idea is revolting, I said, rising to my feet and pacing up and down the room. The murderer kills this man, his friend, shoves him into the chest, and half an hour later is dancing in that same room with the wife of his victim. Think, if she had imagined for one moment. True, said Poirot thoughtfully. That much vaunted possession, a woman's intuition, it does not seem to have been working. The party seems to have gone off very merrily, I said with a slight shiver. And all that time, as they danced and played poker, there was a dead man in the room with them. One could write a play about such an idea. It has been done, said Poirot. But console yourself, Hastings, he added kindly. Because a theme has been used once, there is no reason why it should not be used again. Compose your drama. I had picked up the paper and was studying the rather blurred reproduction of a photograph. She must be a beautiful woman, I said slowly. Even from this, one gets an idea. Below the picture ran the inscription. A recent portrait of Mrs. Clayton, the wife of the murdered man. Poirot took the paper from me. Yes, he said. She is beautiful. Doubtless she is of those born to trouble, the souls of men. He handed the paper back to me with a sigh. Dieu merci, I am not of an ardent temperament. It has saved me from many embarrassments. I am duly thankful. I do not remember that we discussed the case further. Poirot displayed no special interest in it at the time. The facts were so clear, and there was so little ambiguity about them, that discussion seemed merely futile. Mr. and Mrs. Clayton and Major Rich were friends of fairly long standing. On the day in question, the 10th of March, the Claytons had accepted an invitation to spend the evening with Major Rich. At about 7:30, however, Clayton explained to another friend, a Major Curtis, with whom he was having a drink, that he had been unexpectedly called to Scotland and was leaving by the 8 o'clock train. I'll just have time to drop in and explain to old Jack, went on Clayton. Margarita is going, of course. I'm sorry about it, but Jack will understand how it is. Mr. Clayton was as good as his word. He arrived at Major Rich's rooms about 20 to 8. The Major was out at the time, but his manservant, who knew Mr. Clayton, well, suggested that he come in and wait. Mr. Clayton said that he had no time, but that he would come in and write a note. He added that he was on his way to catch a train. The valet accordingly showed him into the sitting room. About 5 minutes later, Major Rich, who must have let himself in without the valet hearing him, opened the door of the sitting room, called his man and told him to go out and get some cigarettes. On his return, the man brought them to his master, who was then alone in the sitting room. The man naturally concluded that Mr. Clayton had left. The guests arrived shortly afterwards. They comprised Mrs. Clayton, Major Curtis, and a Mr. and Mrs. Spence. The evening was spent dancing to the phonograph and playing poker. The guests left shortly after midnight. The following morning, on coming to do the sitting room, the valet was startled to find a deep stain discoloring the carpet below and in front of a piece of furniture which Major Rich had brought from the East and which was called the Baghdad Chest. Instinctively, the valet lifted the lid of the chest and was horrified to find inside the doubled-up body of a man who had been stabbed to the heart. Terrified, the man ran out of the flat and fetched the nearest policeman. The dead man proved to be Mr. Clayton. The arrest of Major Rich followed very shortly afterward. The Major's defense, it was understood, consisted of a sturdy denial of everything. He had not seen Mr. Clayton the preceding evening, and the first he had heard of his going to Scotland had been from Mrs. Clayton. Such were the bald facts of the case. Innuendos and suggestions naturally abounded. The close friendship and intimacy of Major Rich and Mrs. Clayton were so stressed that only a fool could fail to read between the lines. The motive for the crime was plainly indicated. Long experience has taught me to make allowance for baseless calumny. The motive suggested might, for all the evidence, be entirely non-existent. Some quite other reason might have precipitated the issue. But one thing did stand out clearly, that Rich was the murderer. As I say, the matter might have rested there, had it not happened that Poirot and I were due at a party given by Lady Chatterton that night. Poirot, whilst bemoaning social engagements and declaring a passion for solitude, really enjoyed these affairs enormously. To be made a fuss of and treated as a lion suited him down to the ground. On occasions he positively purred. I have seen him blandly receiving the most outrageous compliments as no more than his due, and uttering the most blatantly conceited remarks, such as I can hardly bear to set down. Sometimes he would argue with me on the subject. But, my friend, I am not an Anglo-Saxon. Why should I play the hypocrite? CSI, that is what you do, all of you. The airman who has made a difficult flight, the tennis champion. They look down their noses. They mutter inaudibly that it is nothing. But do they really think that themselves? Not for a moment. They would admire the exploit in someone else. So, being reasonable men, they admire it in themselves. But their training prevents them from saying so. Me, I am not like that. The talents that I possess, I would salute them in another. As it happens, in my own particular line, there is no one to touch me. Say damage. As it is, I admit freely and without hypocrisy that I am a great man. I have the order, the method, and the psychology in an unusual degree. I am, in fact, Hercule Poirot. Why should I turn red and stammer and mutter into my chin that really I am very stupid? It would not be true. There is certainly only one Hercule Poirot, I agreed, not without a spice of malice of which, fortunately, Poirot remained quite oblivious. Lady Chatterton was one of Poirot's most ardent admirers. Starting from the mysterious conduct of a Pekingese, he had unraveled a chain which led to a noted burglar and housebreaker. Lady Chatterton had been loud in his praises ever since. To see Poirot at a party was a great sight. His faultless evening clothes, the exquisite set of his white tie, the exact symmetry of his hair parting, the sheen of pomade on his hair, and the tortured splendor of his famous mustaches, all combined to paint the perfect picture of an inveterate dandy. It was hard, at these moments, to take the little man seriously. It was about 11:30 when Lady Chatterton, bearing down upon us, whisked Poirot neatly out of an admiring group and carried him off, I need hardly say, with myself in tow. "I want you to go into my little room upstairs," said Lady Chatterton rather breathlessly as soon as she was out of earshot of her other guests. "You know where it is, Poirot. You'll find someone there who needs your help very badly. And you will help her, I know. She's one of my dearest friends. So don't say no." Energetically leading the way as she talked, Lady Chatterton flung open a door, exclaiming as she did so, "I've got him, Margarita darling, and he'll do anything you want. You will help Mrs. Clayton, won't you, Poirot?" And taking the answer for granted, she withdrew with the same energy that characterized all her movements. Mrs. Clayton had been sitting in a chair by the window. She rose now and came toward us. Dressed in deep mourning, the dull black showed up her fair coloring. She was a singularly lovely woman, and there was about her a simple childlike candor which made her charm quite irresistible. "Alice Chatterton is so kind," she said. "She arranged this. She said you would help me, Poirot. Of course I don't know whether you will or not, but I hope you will." She had held out her hand and Poirot had taken it. He held it now for a moment or two while he stood scrutinizing her closely. There was nothing ill-bred in his manner of doing it. It was more the kind but searching look that a famous consultant gives a new patient as the latter is ushered into his presence. "Are you sure, madam," he said at last, "that I can help you?" "Alice says so." "Yes, but I am asking you, madam." A little flush rose to her cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." "What is it, madam, that you want me to do?" You know who I am?" she asked. "Assuredly. Then you can guess what it is I am asking you to do, M. Poirot, Captain Hastings. I was gratified that she realized my identity. Major Rich did not kill my husband. Why not? I beg your pardon? Poirot smiled at her slight discomfiture. I said, why not? He repeated, I'm not sure that I understand. Yet it is very simple. The police, the lawyers, they will all ask the same question. Why did Major Rich kill M. Clayton? I ask the opposite. I ask you, madam, why did Major Rich not kill Mr. Clayton? You mean why I'm so sure? Well, but I know Major Rich so well. You know Major Rich so well, repeated Poirot tonelessly. The color flamed into her cheeks. Yes, that's what they'll say, what they'll think. Oh, I know. C'est vrai. That is what they will ask you about, how well you knew Major Rich. Perhaps you will speak the truth, perhaps you will lie. It is very necessary for a woman to lie. It is a good weapon. But there are 3 people, madam, to whom a woman should speak the truth. To her father confessor, to her hairdresser, and to her private detective, if she trusts him. Do you trust me, madam? Margarita Clayton drew a deep breath. Yes, she said. I do. I must, she added rather childishly. Then, how well do you know Major Rich? She looked at him for a moment in silence. Then she raised her chin defiantly. I will answer your question. I loved Jack from the first moment I saw him 2 years ago. Lately, I believe he has come to love me. But he has never said so. Epitant, said Poirot. You have saved me a good quarter of an hour by coming to the point without beating the bush. You have the good sense. Now your husband, did he suspect your feelings? I don't know, said Margarita slowly. I thought lately that he might. His manner has been different. But that may have been merely my fancy. Nobody else knew? I do not think so. And, pardon me, madam, you did not love your husband? There were, I think, very few women who would have answered that question as simply as this woman did. They would have tried to explain their feelings. Margarita Clayton said quite simply, no. Bien. Now we know where we are. According to you, madam, Major Rich did not kill your husband. But you realize that all the evidence points to his having done so. Are you aware, privately, of any flaw in that evidence? No. I know nothing. When did your husband first inform you of his visit to Scotland? Just after lunch. He said it was a bore, but he'd have to go. Something to do with land values, he said it was. And, after that, he went out to his club, I think. I didn't see him again. Now, as to Major Rich, what was his manner that evening? Just as usual? Yes, I think so. You are not sure? Margarita wrinkled her brows. He was a little constrained. With me, not with the others. But I thought I knew why that was. You understand? I am sure the constraint or absent-mindedness perhaps describes it better, had nothing to do with Edward. He was surprised to hear that Edward had gone to Scotland, but not unduly so. And nothing else unusual occurs to you in connection with that evening? Margarita thought. No, nothing whatever. You noticed the chest? She shook her head with a little shiver. I don't even remember it, or what it was like. We played poker most of the evening. Who won? Major Rich. I had very bad luck, and so did Major Curtis. The Spences won a little, but Major Rich was the chief winner. The party broke up when? About 12:30, I think. We all left. Together. Ah! Poirot remained silent, lost in thought. I wish I could be more helpful to you, said Mrs. Clayton. I seem to be able to tell you so little. About the present, yes. What about the past, madam? The past? Yes. Have there not been incidents? She flushed. You mean that dreadful little man who shot himself? It wasn't my fault, M. Poirot. Indeed it wasn't. It was not precisely of that incident that I was thinking. That ridiculous duel? But Italians do fight duels. I was so thankful the man wasn't killed. It must have been a relief to you, agreed Poirot gravely. She was looking at him doubtfully. He rose and took her hand in his. "I shall not fight a duel for you, madam," he said, "but I will do what you have asked me. I will discover the truth. And let us hope that your instincts are correct, that the truth will help and not harm you." Our first interview was with Major Curtis. He was a man of about 40, of soldierly build, with very dark hair and a bronzed face. He had known the Claytons for some years and Major Rich also. He confirmed the press reports. Clayton and he had had a drink together at the club just before 7:30, and Clayton had then announced his intention of looking in on Major Rich on his way to Euston. What was Mr. Clayton's manner? Was he depressed or cheerful? The Major considered. He was a slow-spoken man. "Seemed in fairly good spirits," he said at last. "He said nothing about being on bad terms with Major Rich?" "Good Lord, no. They were pals." "He didn't object to his wife's friendship with Major Rich?" The Major became very red in the face. "You've been reading those damned newspapers with their hints and lies." Of course he didn't object. "Why," he said to me, "Margarita's going, of course." "I see." Now during the evening, the manner of Major Rich, was that much as usual? I didn't notice any difference. And Madam? She too was as usual. Well, he reflected. Now I come to think of it, she was a bit quiet, thoughtful and far away. Who arrived first? The Spences. They were there when I got there. As a matter of fact, I'd called round for Mrs. Clayton, but found she'd already started. So I got there a bit late. And how did you amuse yourselves? You danced? You played the cards? A bit of both. Danced first of all. There were 5 of you? Yes, but that's all right because I don't dance. I put on the records and the others danced. Who danced most with whom? Well, as a matter of fact, the Spences like dancing together. They've got a sort of craze on it. Fancy steps and all that. So that Mrs. Clayton danced mostly with Major Rich? That's about it. And then you played poker? Yes. And when did you leave? Oh, quite early. A little after midnight. Did you all leave together? Yes. As a matter of fact, we shared a taxi, dropped Mrs. Clayton first, then me and the Spences took it on to Kensington. Our next visit was to Mr. and Mrs. Spence. Only Mrs. Spence was at home, but her account of the evening tallied with that of Major Curtis, except that she displayed a slight acidity concerning Major Rich's luck at cards. Earlier in the morning Poirot had had a telephone conversation with Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard. As a result, we arrived at Major Rich's rooms and found his manservant, Burgoyne, expecting us. The valet's evidence was very precise and clear. Mr. Clayton had arrived at 20 minutes to 8. Unluckily, Major Rich had just that very minute gone out. Mr. Clayton had said that he couldn't wait, as he had to catch a train, but he would just scrawl a note. He accordingly went into the sitting room to do so. Burgoyne had not actually heard his master come in, as he was running the bath, and Major Rich, of course, let himself in with his own key. In his opinion, it was about 10 minutes later that Major Rich called him and sent him out for cigarettes. No, he had not gone into the sitting room. Major Rich had stood in the doorway. He had returned with the cigarettes 5 minutes later, and on this occasion, he had gone into the sitting room, which was then empty, save for his master, who was standing by the window smoking. His master had inquired if his bath were ready, and on being told it was had proceeded to take it. He, Burgoyne, had not mentioned Mr. Clayton, as he assumed that his master had found Mr. Clayton there and let him out himself. His master's manner had been precisely the same as usual. He had taken his bath, changed, and shortly after Mr. and Mrs. Spence had arrived, to be followed by Major Curtis and Mrs. Clayton. It had not occurred to him, Burgoyne explained, that Mr. Clayton might have left before his master's return. To do so, Mr. Clayton would have had to bang the front door behind him, and that the valet was sure he would have heard. Still, in the same impersonal manner, Burgoyne proceeded to his finding of the body. For the first time my attention was directed to the fatal chest. It was a good-sized piece of furniture standing against the wall next to the phonograph cabinet. It was made of some dark wood and plentifully studded with brass nails. The lid opened simply enough. I looked in and shivered. Though well scrubbed, Ominous stains remained. Suddenly Poirot uttered an exclamation. Those holes there, they are curious. One would say that they had been newly made. The holes in question were at the back of the chest against the wall. There were 3 or 4 of them. They were about 1/4 of an inch in diameter and certainly had the effect of having been freshly made. Poirot bent down to examine them, looking inquiringly at the valet. It's certainly curious, sir. I don't remember ever seeing those holes in the past, though maybe I wouldn't notice them. It makes no matter, said Poirot. Closing the lid of the chest, he stepped back into the room until he was standing with his back against the window. Then he suddenly asked a question. Tell me, he said, when you brought the cigarettes into your master that night, was there not something out of place in the room? Burgoyne hesitated for a minute. Then, with some slight reluctance, he replied, It's odd you're saying that, sir. Now you come to mention it, there was that screen there that cuts off the draught from the bedroom door. It was moved a bit more to the left. Like this. Poirot darted nimbly forward and pulled at the screen. It was a handsome affair of painted leather. It already slightly obscured the view of the chest, and as Poirot adjusted it, it hid the chest altogether. That's right, sir, said the valet. It was like that. And the next morning? It was still like that. I remember. I moved it away and it was then I saw the stain. The carpet's gone to be cleaned, sir. That's why the boards are bare. Poirot nodded. I see, he said. I thank you. He placed a crisp piece of paper in the valet's palm. Thank you, sir. Poirot, I said when we were out in the street, that point about the screen, is that a point helpful to Rich? It is a further point against him, said Poirot ruefully. The screen hid the chest from the room. It also hid the stain on the carpet. Sooner or later the blood was bound to soak through the wood and stain the carpet. The screen would prevent discovery for the moment. Yes, but there is something there that I do not understand. The valet? Hastings, the valet. What about the valet? He seemed a most intelligent fellow. As you say, most intelligent. Is it credible, then, that Major Rich failed to realize that the valet would certainly discover the body in the morning? Immediately after the deed, he had no time for anything, granted. He shoves the body into the chest, pulls the screen in front of it and goes through the evening hoping for the best. But after the guests are gone, surely, then is the time to dispose of the body. Perhaps he hoped the valet wouldn't notice the stain? That, mon ami, is absurd. A stained carpet is the first thing a good servant would be bound to notice. And Major Rich, he goes to bed and snores there comfortably and does nothing at all about the matter. Very remarkable and interesting, that. Curtis might have seen the stains when he was changing the records the night before? I suggested. That is unlikely. The screen would throw a deep shadow just there. No, but I begin to see. Yes, dimly I begin to see. See what? I asked eagerly. The possibilities, shall we say, of an alternative explanation. Our next visit may throw light on things. Our next visit was to the doctor who had examined the body. His evidence was a mere recapitulation of what he had already given at the inquest. Deceased had been stabbed to the heart with a long thin knife, something like a stiletto. The knife had been left in the wound. Death had been instantaneous. The knife was the property of Major Rich and usually lay on his writing table. There were no fingerprints on it, the doctor understood. It had been either wiped or held in a handkerchief. As regards time, any time between 7 and 9 seemed indicated. He could not, for instance, have been killed after midnight? Asked Poirot. No, that I can say. 10 o'clock at the outside, but 7:30 to 8 seems clearly indicated. There is a second hypothesis possible, Poirot said when we were back home. I wonder if you see it, Hastings. To me it is very plain, and I only need one point to clear up the matter for good and all. It's no good, I said. I'm not there. But make an effort, Hastings. Make an effort. Very well, I said. At 7:40 Clayton is alive and well. The last person to see him alive is Rich. So we assume. Well, isn't it so? You forget, mon ami, that Major Rich denies that. He states explicitly that Clayton had gone when he came in. But the valet says that he would have heard Clayton leave because of the bang of the door. And also, if Clayton had left, when did he return? He couldn't have returned after midnight because the doctor says positively that he was dead at least 2 hours before that. That only leaves one alternative. Yes, mon ami, said Poirot. That, in the 5 minutes Clayton was alone in the sitting room, someone else came in and killed him. But there we have the same objection. Only someone with a key could come in without the valet's knowing. And in the same way the murderer on leaving would have had to bang the door, and that again the valet would have heard. Exactly, said Poirot. And therefore nothing, I said. I can see no other solution. It is a pity, murmured Poirot. And it is really so exceedingly simple, as the clear blue eyes of Madame Clayton. You really believe? I believe nothing until I have got proof. One little proof will convince me. He took up the telephone and called Jap at Scotland Yard. 20 minutes later, we were standing before a little heap of assorted objects laid out on a table. They were the contents of the dead man's pockets. There was a handkerchief, a handful of loose change, a pocketbook containing £3 10 shillings, a couple of bills, and a worn snapshot of Margarita Clayton. There was also a pocket knife, a gold pencil, and a cumbersome wooden tool. It was on this latter that Poirot swooped. He unscrewed it and several small blades fell out. You see, Hastings, a gimlet, and all the rest of it. It would be a matter of a very few minutes to bore a few holes in the chest with this. Those holes we saw? Precisely. You mean it was Clayton who bored them himself? Mais oui. What did they suggest to you, those holes? They were not to see through because they were at the back of the chest. What were they for, then? Clearly for air? But you do not make air holes for a dead body, so clearly they were not made by the murderer. They suggest one thing, and one thing only, that a man was going to hide in that chest. And at once, on that hypothesis, things become intelligible. Mr. Clayton is jealous of his wife and Rich. He plays the old trick of pretending to go away. He watches Rich go out, then he gains admission, is left alone to write a note, quickly bores those holes and hides inside the chest. Wife is coming there that night. Possibly Rich will put the others off. Possibly she will remain after the others have gone, or pretend to go and return. Whatever it is, Clayton will know. Anything is preferable to the ghastly torment of suspicion he is enduring. Then you mean that Rich killed him after the others had gone? But the doctor said that was impossible. Exactly. So you see, Hastings, he must have been killed during the evening. But everyone was in the room. Precisely, said Poirot gravely. You see the beauty of that. Everyone was in the room. What an alibi. What sang-froid. What nerve. What audacity. I still don't understand. Who went behind that screen to wind up the phonograph and change the records? The phonograph and the chest were side by side, remember. The others are dancing, the phonograph is playing. And the man who does not dance lifts the lid of the chest and thrusts the knife he has just slipped into his sleeve deep into the body of the man who was hiding there. Impossible, man would cry out. Not if he were drugged first? Drugged? Yes. Who did Clayton have a drink with at 7:30? Now you see. Curtis. Curtis has inflamed Clayton's mind with suspicions against his wife and Rich. Curtis suggests this plan, the visit to Scotland, the concealment in the chest, the final touch of moving the screen. Not so that Clayton can raise the lid a little and get relief, no, so that he, Curtis, can raise that lid unobserved. The plan is Curtis's, and observe the beauty of it. Hastings. If Rich had observed the screen was out of place and moved it back, well, no harm is done. He can make another plan. Clayton hides in the chest. The mild narcotic that Curtis had administered takes effect. He sinks into unconsciousness. Curtis lifts up the lid and strikes. And the phonograph goes on playing, "Walking My Baby Back Home." I found my voice. Why? But why? Poirot shrugged his shoulders. Why did a man shoot himself? Why did two Italians fight a duel? Curtis is of a dark, passionate temperament. He wanted Margarita Clayton. With her husband and Rich out of the way, she would, or so he thought, turn to him. He added musingly, These simple childlike women, they are very dangerous. But mon Dieu, what an artistic masterpiece. It goes to my heart to hang a man like that. I may be a genius myself, but I am capable of recognizing genius in other people. Perfect murder, mon ami. I Hercule Poirot say it to you. Perfect murder. Evident, please subscribe, like this video for more great audiobook stories, and check my channel.